Welcome to Status Secure, the weekly cyber threat briefing for executives who refuse to operate in the blind. Hosted by the Watcher 6 Collective, uniting former Army Special Forces and Naval Special Warfare Communications operators, alongside an industry-leading CISO nominated for Cybersecurity Woman of the World. We cut through the noise and give you the operational intelligence you need for mission success in a hostile digital environment. The enemy is listening. Is your status secure? Welcome to Status Secure. Today we are covering the software supply chain attacks that are quietly compromising organizations through the vendors and the code they trust. The new attack surface that Agentic AI is opening up inside every enterprise, and then we're going to get into everything you need to know about SOC 2. CISO, let's start with the supply chain. Why is this the defining threat pattern of 2026, and why does it hit every industry at once?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. We talk about supply chain all the time. And the reason is because since 2020, it's there's a significant increase, nearly 4 times as many supply chain attacks, right? So the attacks, the patterns matured beyond one-off vendor breaches, right? The threats are now the relationship between CI/CD automation tools, software packages, and SaaS integrations. Right? There's more companies using third parties. And then of course there's once you get into the pipeline of a company, right, into their supply chain, things like cloud secrets, GitHub credentials, SSH keys, CI/CD tokens. I mean, once they get those, they're in, right? And it hits every industry because whether you're in GovCon or healthcare or, a startup, it doesn't matter. If you're using a third party, this is an area that you have a high risk in. So, so it's really important too to understand the difference between, third party breach versus like supply chain attack. Third party breach means that one of your vendors got breached. Doesn't mean that you are impacted. So you need to understand that, right? So a supply chain attack, right? A breach means that not only did they get your vendor, but now it's impacted you and they've got you too.
Yeah, and layered on top of that is this new attack surface from Agentic AI. So walk us through that, because this is a threat surface most organizations may not have on their radar yet, may not be prepared for yet. It's not part of their asset inventory yet, let's say. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a lot of companies are trying to move really fast with AI, right? But, it took a while when the internet first started for people to look at security, right? And so that's the same here. I mean, the good thing is we have experience, so we're looking at it. But just imagine if your AI agent were to get hacked, right? Now it's a helpful insider. It has access to a lot of things and a lot of information and has a lot of access. So it becomes a really large threat, right? Instead of being helpful to you, now it's helpful to the, bad actors. And this makes it even worse because everybody, everybody's using AI coding tools and agents, right? That are being supplied by companies who are providing, AI resources because you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the skills. So you're using them from third parties. And once those AI tools and packages are have been exploited, now everybody who's using that, has potential to be impacted. The other thing is that most companies that are using AI agents don't know what they have. It's that asset thing, right, that we always talk about. How can you protect what you don't know? And people are building agents so fast, companies are using them so fast that they don't have time to inventory them.
Got it. So I'm listening to this, and regardless of, what vector I'm working in, and what do I do this week to close the gap on both supply chain risk and Agentic AI exposure?
Well, you can't defend what you can't, what you don't know and what you can't see, right? So generate a software bill of materials and SBOM for your critical applications, so you know every package and dependency you're actually running. Pair that with a vendor inventory listing, every third party with access to your environment. You should already know that. If you don't, you should do that. You can't protect what you don't know. Right? Second, inventory and govern your non-human identities, right? The same thing. You need an inventory of your supply chain. You need an inventory of your your AI agents, your non-human identities, your service accounts. I mean, these are, these have been controls for a long time. You just have to expand them into AI. Third, lock down your CI/CD pipeline and secrets. The TeamPCP attack specifically targeted GitHub credentials and cloud secrets, SSH keys, and CI/CD tokens. We talked about this earlier. Rotate your secrets. Make sure you're following good hygiene, good practices, and enforce phishing resistant MFA on every developer and pipeline account. The pipeline is the new perimeter, and in 2026, it is under direct attack.
And here's why this may land the hardest on tech startups. When an enterprise customer is deciding whether to trust your software with their data, the conversation we just had about supply chain risk and agent access is exactly what they're worried about. And so the document they ask for to prove you have it handled would be the SOC 2 report in many cases. So with that as a setup, let's go ahead and get into the SOC 2 briefing. So why don't you give us a foundational walkthrough? I would imagine most founders have heard of SOC 2. Maybe heard of it, maybe even from a client who said, we can't do business with you guys until you're SOC 2 certified. But maybe many of them haven't heard it explained from the ground up. Like, what is it? Where does it come from? And what does it actually require?
Yeah. So, so let's talk about, SOC. So where it comes from, it actually comes from financial auditing, right? That's why the AICPA, so the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, governs that. So you have to have a CPA firm to perform the SOC 2. Nobody else can actually issue a SOC 2 or a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. And you can look up the history if you want, but basically they were already doing auditing. I don't know if you remember Enron, but there was a lot of, cooking of the books, right? And so, it created a lot of havoc and a lot of other things. But from that, they were like, okay, well, we need controls over financial statements. And then they said, well, if we can do financial controls, we can also do security, other kinds of controls, right? So that's how the SOC 2 came about. And so it's not a regulator, but it's an industry, well-known standard now. So SOC 1 versus SOC 2 versus SOC 3, people get confused about this. Just remember this, SOC 1 is your financial statements. So it's an audit of how you generate your financial statement. Okay. So usually we don't, the finance folks deal with that and the business folks deal with that. SOC 2 is an audit of like the services that you provide and how those services are developed, right? So SOC 2 is the one that we're really familiar with, right? That covers controls relevant to the trust services criteria, security, availability. You've got processing integrity, right? Confidentiality, privacy. The only one that you are required to do that you can't elect to not do is security. That is the foundation of a SOC 2. And then everything else you can choose. So be careful. Like you have to understand when you're asking for a SOC 2 and you're looking at it and when you are required to do a SOC 2. Security is required. Everything else you have to take a look, right? And there are good controls to just make sure they're foundational for availability, processing integrity, confident, but you have to know when and why you would choose the other trust criteria. Okay. And it's not, people always say it's a certification. I hear that a lot and it gets used that way. It's not a certification per se. It's not, like if you get like Microsoft certified on something, usually that means that, your configurations, are based on the standards required by Microsoft, something like that. This is not the same thing. This is a CPA firm's opinion on whether your system description is fairly presented. So system description is basically what are the services you're providing and how do you organize to provide those services, okay? And whether your controls are suitably designed. So in a type 1, that's just the design. So they just want to, it's a 30-day, period that they're looking at, and you can design your controls right away, and then you can give evidence, right? That's a type 1. So it's really at the design. They're not looking to see whether or not those controls are actually working over a period of time, right? And working effectively. That's your type 2. Okay. So that's the difference between the SOC 1, SOC 2, type 1, type 2, right? So remember that. SOC 3 is even less. Hardly anybody ever does a SOC 3. SOC 3 is for your board, really, if you want. But like, again, I said, most people stick with SOC 1 and SOC 2, they do type 1 first, and then they go to type 2, because one is design of your controls. The other is how effectively is it operating over a period of time.
Got it. Yeah. And I guess for maybe layman's terms, you could say type 1 is like, here's my flow chart. Here's my wireframe of my environment. And it's like, cool, that's up to snuff. Got it. Where type 2 is like, are you actually doing that wireframe? Like you presented that layout, but like, is that something you're actually doing? So now we're going to sit here and observe you and see if you're actually following it or not. So that's maybe for the layman's terms, for those who maybe don't understand the difference, that's the difference. And then in order to go to type 2, because I think maybe there might be some people going, well, do I need to get type 1 first? What is that? I know we get a lot of people that come in and they're like, okay, I need SOC 2 type 2. That's what I need. So when they come in and say that, what's the process for them? And maybe how long does that take?
So usually I would say length of time. Just that's the other thing, right? Because it depends on your audit period. If you're mature and you've been doing it for a while, it's an audit period of 1 year, which means that you're being audited on things on the control operating for an entire year. I've seen 6 months. I've seen the shortest is 3 months. So what I see is people will start out with, like, again, the type 1, right? And then they'll do the 3 month, then they'll move to 6 month, and eventually they get to 1 year. How long it takes depends on how mature your controls are, right? So I would say if you have nothing, expect just to design your controls and get them in place, at least 6 months. Because you want to make sure that they're there. You don't want to go through the trouble of paying for a SOC, audit report, and it comes out qualified. So qualified, unqualified. You want an unqualified, right? Which means that the CPA auditors didn't find anything too risky, right? That your controls were operating and there's not a big risk in your organization. If it's qualified, that means they found risks in your organization. But 6 months to design and put in place, depending on how complicated and how quickly you can get them in too. So keep that in mind. If you have a large organization, and I'm talking 6 months for a startup, the bigger you are, the longer it's going to take, right? And then for an audit itself, again, it's the audit period, right? So when you're ready, if it's a 3 months, I would plan for the audit to take about 4 months, because you have 4 to 5 months, because you have the planning before the actual audit begins. You have all the audit work, doing the field work. That's what they call it when they're requesting evidence. And then you have the end where they're, drafting the report, going back and forth with you before they issue it. Right? So keep that in mind. So just think of it that way. So if that's for a 3 month audit period, just imagine how long that would take for 6 months, right? Just add on 6 months plus what you need to prepare. And at the end, we usually tack on a month, right? For the back and forth and the draft, and to go through all the reviews. And same thing with 1 year.
Got it. So if we take a different angle at this and look at it from maybe a business lens, right? You might have 2 people in this conversation. Let's say we're in a startup and there's 2 people in the SOC 2 conversation. You have maybe the business person, and then you have the technical person. And the technical person is listening to what you just said, going, here's the process. We do this, we do this, we do this. This is what needs to get done so that this is what we can accomplish and have at the end of, let's say, 12 months. And then on the other hand, you have the business person who's going, I want the business. I want this deal with someone who's requiring us to have SOC 2. Am I really going to go and tell them, come back a year from now? And so maybe a way I can frame it is, you have, let's say in another situation, you might have like an LOA, right? A letter of agreement. And basically that's saying, hey, I can go get X. I can go do business get a loan, right? Get this thing I need over here by bringing this LOA with me, by saying, look, I may not have the business yet. Like, this person hasn't actually, we're not giving them the services. They're not paying us money, but they've agreed to it. And so then they can get backed by that in some cases, right? Think of it that way. So we can go, I have SOC 2 type 1, because we can get that a lot faster. So you can say, look, let's get that SOC 2 type 1 done, because then I can tell these people, look, we've got our SOC 2 type 1, and basically like an LOA, I'm working on type 2. This is what's happening. And that might make them more comfortable to move forward, especially if they want and need your service, right? So there is that's, kind of the business approach of like, this is something we're working on, but look, hey, if you it just takes time, right? So let's, instead of just saying, let's knock out the whole pipeline in 12 months, let's knock out type 1, get the paperwork, use that to get the business, the ball rolling as we're working on getting type 2 done.
Yeah, it's funny. Every time you say LOA, I always think of leave of absence.
Oh,
But yeah, absolutely. And in this case, what CPA firms will do will write you a letter of engagement, right? Which is really the agreement that they're going to do the audit. And so I've seen companies use the letter of engagement, right, or a statement of work or something like that, to say, hey, we're in the process, right? And depending on like what what business you're trying to get, because in some cases, if it's a bid, and they say SOC 2 is required, just remember to ask the question, right? Because usually there's a question and answer before the bid proposal is due. Just make sure you ask, if we're not SOC 2, but we have an engagement letter, would that suffice, right? And depending on relationships, right? If it's not like a bid that's open to everybody, or if you have a relationship with that potential client, you can ask them. And some companies are really understanding of that, because they do know it takes a while to get the SOC 2 sometimes.
yeah. And so for those maybe wondering, what would maybe a typical cost range be for doing this process?
Yeah, again, it depends on the size and then and the complexity of your controls, right? And so ranges between, I would say, for a startup, and mid-size, 10 to 50,000. I mean, if you're a larger company, I've known companies, and depending who your CPA firm is, if you're talking one of the the big four, it's going to be a lot more. So let's say small to medium, you're looking at 10 to 50,000 just for the CPA portion, right? If you're larger than that, it's going to cost you more. Like I've seen 75,000 to like 150,000, right? But again, it depends on the size of and the complexity of your organization.
Yeah, and that's just the audit, right? To have someone come in and help you get ready for the audit, that's going to be its own cost. And that, of course, is going to depend on what you do, size of the company, all of that stuff, right? And so what you're talking about right now is specifically the last piece, is for that outside third-party CPA firm that does this audit. That's the price you were giving for that. Of course, again, there's another price to have someone come in and get you there, so that you only pay that price once, so you don't fail and have to do it again.
Yeah, and I do have a warning for our listeners. If you haven't look up Delve, right? So people were jumping on the Delve bandwagon because Delve said that they could get you SOC 2 for a lot cheaper, right? And now their doors have closed. They're under investigation. All the clients have to redo their SOC, their SOC. So cheap is not always the best, the best. Like if you're just looking for a compliance check, just be careful about that. You really want to have a real CPA firm doing the hard work of checking your controls.
Yeah, and a real company organization helping you get there. Maybe not just a boilerplate templated checklist provided by some kind of AI tool, which sounds cool, free, or cheap, or whatever, but it may not get you what you want. You get what you pay for, kind of situation in this. So we're coming to the end of this. So let's go to our marching orders for the founders, the business people, the engineers, whoever's listening to this, that's going, okay, I might need the SOC 2, or maybe we're talking about the supply chain attacks or the agentic AI risk we brought up earlier in the conversation. So what are 3 things that every tech startup could execute to help close those gaps?
Well, the first is you need to scope your SOC 2, right? I mean, you need to understand and figure out which trust services criteria you're going to do, right? Because that's really important. Do you want to do a type 1, type 2, right? Those are all important. What's your audit period, right? Like 6 months, 12 months, right? So scope that. And then make sure that you're building your control evidence, right? So, when you're mapping out your controls to the common criteria, I know this is like very compliance speak, right? But it's part of the work that has to be done. When you build your controls to the common criteria, right? Make sure you're also not only designing and writing up the description of your control, but that you also know what the evidence is going to look like. Okay? That's very important. And then, don't forget about what we talked about earlier. Map your AI and vendor risk, right, into your controls. That's going to be very important too. When you build your control, make sure it's really actually useful to you and not just something, that you create so you can check the box, right, for compliance.
Got it. Well, supply chain attacks and agentic AI are reshaping the threat surface for every industry in 2026. So for tech startups, the operational truth is that enterprise customers you want are watching exactly these risks. And the SOC 2 report is how you can prove to them that you've handled it before they'll trust you with their data. So mission success starts with closing the gap between the threat and the framework and getting the credential ahead of the demand curve, while it is still a competitive advantage and not just the cost of admission. So trust, but verify your own posture, scope your SOC 2, build the evidence pipeline, map your AI and vendor risk into the control set. So let's execute the standard, and we'll see you next week. Mission success isn't about luck. It's about preparation. You've heard the intel. Now, go put it to use. If you need to verify your security posture, I've established a secure line at watcher6.com/secure. Go there to get the briefing the enemy doesn't want you to have. We'll see you next week. Until then, keep your head on a swivel.